In mid-16th century Europe, there were three queens who floated above the hellish and violent atmosphere of religious intolerance and changing values. Elizabeth I, Queen of England, her father was loaded because he dissolved all the monasteries and then sold the land off to his mates. Then there was Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. No discernible personality, but for a brief time she was also Queen of France. And then there was Catherine de' Medici, the Almighty. She was a mythic bitch. Or was she? For real though, Catherine de' Medici is one of the most notorious quote-unquote rulers of Renaissance Europe. I say that because while she did have some power, she ruled in France only as regent. Nonetheless, her influence within the French court, from her own political savviness to other factions bickering amongst each other for too long to notice she was there, kept the royal family and the House of Valois afloat until her death, where it would then collapse in less than a year. Granted, a lot of her more nefarious deeds have been exaggerated. Much like with Richard III, what were probably political necessities done by Catherine for long-term gain would easily have been twisted by Protestants and the incoming House of Bourbon into something a lot more nefarious. Despite birthing 10 children, the House of Valois practically died with her, and all but 2 of her children would predecease her. It's almost impossible to understand how much anguish and sorrow Catherine de' Medici experienced throughout her life. Was she truly heartless? Or was she willing to be the villain in the eyes of history if it meant her family would be safe? Let's meet Catherine de' Medici, or, if you prefer, Catherine de' Medici, the Queen of Venom. Now, before I explain the circumstances of Catherine's birth, first I need to explain the House of Medici. I am also likely to switch between saying Medici and Medici. I've heard it pronounced both ways, so I think we can get away with saying it both ways. The Medici family originated in the Florentine Republic. This was at a time when the Italian peninsula was divided into smaller states before unifying in 1861 into the Kingdom of Italy. Florence was its own state between 1115 and 1569, before it became a Grand Duchy ruled hereditarily by the Medici family. They had gained power and influence throughout the Middle Ages via banking. Florence itself was a hub for the merchant class and grew exponentially through the wealth accumulated there. Much like the Lannisters, the Medici were able to buy influence through marriage alliances and gaining political positions, ultimately becoming oligarchical rulers of Florence itself. Sons who would not be inheriting their father's wealth would either become prevalent in the army or the church. This led to 2 Medici family members becoming pope. The Borgias weren't the only ones who bought their way into the papacy. First, there was Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici, who became Leo X. His successor lasted all of 8 months and 5 days before Giulio de' Medici became Pope Clement VII. While he may have had his family's wealth to back him, the papacy and the Romagna was primarily supported by the Holy Roman Empire in Austria. Catherine was born on 13th of April 1519. Her father, the Duke of Urbino and current political leader in Florence, had married her French mother, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, the previous year. Her birth was celebrated by her parents as if she had been a boy. However, this was short-lived. Catherine's mother died 9 days after her birth. Her cause of death has been debated, but was likely childbed fever. Meanwhile, her father died on the 4th of May from disease and excess. Pope Leo X became Catherine's guardian. She remained in Florence despite the French king wishing for her to come to his court, and was looked after by her grandmother and aunt respectively. When Pope Clement VII took office, he promoted Catherine's right to the dukedom of Urbino by having her live in the Medici's palace in Florence. Pope Clement managed to run the Republic well before he became Pope, but the Medici appointees and Cardinal Passerini who took his place were not as popular. Then, in 1527, the Spanish and the Austrians marched on Rome. Remember that scene in Anne of the Thousand Days when Cardinal Wolsey says Rome was sacked? Yeah, this is what he was referring to.
The dead in their hundreds lie unburied in the streets.
The Pope?
Is besieged.
Pope Clement was captured and imprisoned by Charles V. Taking advantage of this, anti-Medici Florentines overthrew the ruling family. The opulent, vain and excessive lifestyle of the Medici family was cast out in favour of a more pious and modest way of life. Catherine, now 8 years old, spent the next 3 years living in convents. She was not in any real danger until the now released Pope Clement strove to retake Florence in October 1529. Catherine, being a prime hostage, was targeted by the starving citizens. They wanted to take out their frustration on the nearest available Medici. They suggested they lower her naked from the city gates to mock the Pope's army, or give her to the soldiers defending the city, and ruin any chances for an advantageous marriage. She was forcefully removed from the Muret convent, where she had donned a nun's habit, declaring she was a bride of Christ. The next convent, St. Lucia, became her prison for 23 days before the siege lifted, and she was summoned from Florence to Rome, where Pope Clement greeted her with open arms. Catherine's experience in the siege of Florence had already formed her view of the world. Following her liberation, she thanked the nuns who had taken care of her, as well as Silvestro Aldobrandini, who had protected her from being attacked while she was in captivity. She had learned kindness was just as useful as fear. In Rome, she was installed in the Medici's palace, where she was taught everything she needed to be a desirable wife. She gained a love of art and reading and was regularly welcomed by the papal court. She learned Greek, Latin, French, mathematics and music. At some point after Florence was stabilised, she was returned to the city of her birth. She grew close to her illegitimate cousin Ippolito de' Medici, who had been made a cardinal at the age of 17, but he was sent to Hungary in 1532 and died in mysterious circumstances in 1535, aged 24. As a niece to the Pope and legitimate heir of a wealthy family who had just recently been ennobled, Catherine was a well-sought-after bride. Offers came in from all across Italy, as well as Austria and France. Henry VIII of England also bid for her to marry his illegitimate son Henry Fitzroy, whom he had named Duke of Richmond, in anticipation of him making a good match. Then came England's break with Rome, and it was quickly discarded. King James V of Scotland was also considered, but an alliance between two such distant lands was too expensive in Pope Clement's eyes. But the winning bid would be Francois I of France, for the hand of his second son, Henri de Valois, Duc d'Orléans. King Francois demanded a lot from the Vatican, including ownership of several Italian territories, including Pisa and Urbino, as well as for Catherine to come to the French court immediately. Pope Clement wanted to hang on to his beneficial niece for as long as possible, bringing a match that would benefit the Vatican but avoid further conflict with the Spanish Emperor. Marriage negotiations were held under strict secrecy until they were finally agreed upon in early 1533. The match between the Duke of Orléans and Catherine de' Medici was called the greatest match in the world. The two of them were born only 2 weeks apart, so they didn't have to worry about age differences, and seeing as they were both 14, they were expected to start breeding very soon after they were married. Prince Henri, like Catherine, had endured a traumatic childhood when his father lost to the Spanish in 1525 and was taken prisoner, only for him and his older brother, also named Francois, to be exchanged as hostages. The brothers, whose mother had died just the year before, were imprisoned until 1529. While they had been treated well at first, they were held under increasingly strict conditions, where all their French attendants, save one, were taken from them and sold into slavery. Henri is said to have acted aggressively throughout this ordeal, and had to be watched at all times due to his repeated escape attempts. When the princes were released in 1530, they were presented horses as gifts, as if to say no hard feelings. The Dauphin Francois graciously accepted them, while Henri turned his back on the captors. He had withdrawn into himself over the course of his imprisonment, and neither prince seemed happy to return to their father, King Francois, who lacked all self-awareness, remarking that he didn't have time for such dreamy, sullen, sleepy children. Read the chambermaid. Henri developed a fascination with sport and kept a close-knit group of noble youths, with his only female confidant being an older courtier named Diane du Poitiers. It was this Henri that Catherine met when she came to France in October 1533. King Francois and his two sons convened at Marseille and greeted Catherine and Pope Clement, who arrived by sea. The bride and groom were allowed to meet 5 days before they married, as the wedding celebrations took place over several days. The ceremony took place on the 28th of October, with Pope Clement himself officiating the match, followed by a masked ball. At the French court, it was customary that at the end of every marriage feast, especially for a royal wedding, the bride and groom were taken to a bedchamber where they would be required to consummate their marriage in front of witnesses, and King Francois was one of them. Awkward. Catherine made a decent debut into life at the French court. She was well liked by the women for her intelligence, but she rarely saw her husband. King Francois was excited to conquer Italian territories for France with the Pope's blessing. Then Pope Clement died. It was less than a year into Catherine and Henri's marriage, and her full dowry had not yet been paid to France. And his successor, Paul III of Farnese, immediately ceased the French alliance. This led to Catherine and Henri's marriage turning from lukewarm to barely existent. Henri began taking mistresses, the most prominent of whom was Diane de Poitiers, who, as I stated, was 19 years his senior. He named his first illegitimate child after Diane, whom he sired with Philippa Ducci. This only humiliated Catherine further, as it proved that Henri was able to have children, so clearly there must have been something wrong with her. Wishing to make the best out of a bad situation, Catherine decided to make herself indispensable by getting on King Francois's good side. She joined him when he went hunting or riding, making the side saddle popular in France. He admired her wit and patience with his son in return. She would also befriend the rest of the Valois family at court, notably Henri's sisters Marguerite and Madeleine, as well as Marguerite of Navarre, who, as you may remember, made a great influence on Anne Boleyn in regards to religious reform. Henri's attitude to Catherine was unchanged, however. He seemed mostly susceptible to Diane's influence, where he would only sleep with his wife at her insistence, in order to make sure they had legitimate children. But nothing seemed to change. Had Henri been Dauphin at the time, Catherine might have been at a much more precarious state, and she would have become a figure of gossip and ridicule for being barren, much like Marie Antoinette would endure 250 years later. But as second in line, Henri and Catherine's prospects were kept in reserve. The real goal was to make sure that the Dauphin Francois made a good match and had children. Then, in 1536, King Francois took his sons on another military campaign against the Spanish. The Dauphin was having a tennis match on a very hot day in August. At the end of the game, he called for some water, which was delivered by an Italian gentleman, Sebastian de Montecuccoli, who served as the Dauphin's secretary. Montecuccoli came with Catherine's coterie when she was married. Immediately upon drinking the water, Francois collapsed and caught a fever, where he died on the 10th of August. As the prince was considered in good health, everyone's first instinct was to assume he had been poisoned, and the blame fell directly on Sebastian de Montecuccoli. I need to put my glasses on. I'm sorry, I can feel my eyes being strained already. I'm just going to have to ignore the circle that reflected my glasses. Though a post-mortem was performed, and they found nothing suspicious. The vengeful King Francois wanted someone to suffer for it, and the person who had given his son the water became the perfect scapegoat. Montecuccoli was tortured, and a book of toxicology was found among his possessions, though that might have been planted there to frame him. He confessed to accusations that he was ordered to do it by the Spanish Emperor, and he was executed by dismemberment on the 7th of October. This is where the limbs of the condemned are tied to 4 horses, which are then sent to bolt in opposite directions, tearing the condemned to pieces. The English had a similar punishment by hanging, drawing and quartering convicted traitors. It was such a grisly punishment that it was only reserved for people who had committed treason. In the wake of this sudden loss, Catherine and Henri were made Dauphine and Dauphin of France. Now her struggles to conceive were put at the forefront of French politics. If the Valois could not succeed, the House of Bourbon was waiting to take their place. Catherine took to trying numerous fertility methods in order to conceive a child with Henri, including cow dung and mule's urine. Where she put them is not safe for work. It is thought that there was some incompatibility with the couple's genitals, and with a physician's help they managed to at last conceive their first child in 1543. On the 19th of January 1544, Catherine gave birth to a son, another Francois. His birth was witnessed by his grandfather, the king, who wanted to make sure that everything turned out as planned. The arrival of a new prince was widely celebrated throughout France. The following year, Catherine had her first daughter, Elizabeth, and had recently conceived her third child when King Francis died on the 31st of March 1547, on his son's 28th birthday. As a result of his hedonistic and sex-fueled lifestyle, he had caught gonorrhea, which led to infections in his kidneys and lungs. Catherine was nearby in his final days, and wept for him, knowing what little influence she had at court would almost certainly be wiped out in favour of Diane de Poitiers. In her 12 years as Queen Consort of France, Catherine would have to demonstrate a considerable amount of patience. While Diane de Poitiers enjoyed all the privileges as queen, Catherine's main role was primarily a broodmare. She and Henri did not have a joint coronation as would usually have been expected. Instead, he greeted her as he processed into the city of Reims, while she watched from a window. And he went up to meet with Diane and wore a tunic intertwining his initials with his mistress's at his coronation ceremony. In November of 1547, Catherine gave birth to a second daughter, Claude. Early in 1549, she had her second son, Louis. She was then granted a coronation ceremony of her own on 10th of June, but even then, Diane de Poitiers had to be appeased, as she was made a duchess in her own right and sat to Catherine's left during her ceremony, along with Henri's daughter Diane. Nonetheless, Catherine maintained a modest and dignified persona. The following year, Catherine had another son, Charles, although Louis would die a few months later of what was believed to be a chill. Another son, Henri, came in 1551, followed by a third daughter, Marguerite, who I will refer to as Margot. And Hercule, born in 1555, was the last of Catherine's children who would survive infancy. Catherine's final pregnancy was with twin girls, Jeanne and Victoire, but giving birth to them nearly resulted in her death. Victoire was born safely, but Jeanne became stuck, and the difficult decision was made to break her legs, ultimately killing her, so Catherine's life could be saved. Despite this sacrifice, Victoire would also pass away 7 weeks after birth. As traumatic as this must have been for Catherine, the takeaway Henry saw in this was it was too dangerous to have any more children with his wife. Besides, he had 4 living sons and plenty of daughters to marry off and form alliances. He had done his duty with his wife, and then some. Catherine, meanwhile, did not think her usefulness had ended. 4 years into Henri's reign, he began the Italian War, where his dear friend the Duc de Guise was one of his key military leaders. It was this war that defined his reign, as he took on both the Spanish in the west and the Holy Roman Empire in the east. Catherine had a personal agenda in this war, in seeing the Medici benefit from gaining Italian land. While Henri was campaigned, Catherine served as regent of France, raising money and troops to keep in reserve, as well as scrutinising public opinion, such as having preachers speaking against the war discreetly removed and replaced with more favourable ones. It was at this time when Catherine got her taste for power and learned how to both appease and manipulate the court to her will. Henri began to recognise her importance and started taking her advice on how to cooperate with Italian generals. The end of the war resulted in victory for the Spanish and Austrians. France would have to bequeath territories while receiving some back from Spain. However, one key victory was that France managed to retake Calais from the English after 200 years of English occupation. England now had no territory on the mainland continent. Their queen, Mary I, died not long after. King Henri also had his sights on England, despite the economic strain the Italian War had placed on France. In 1542, Marie de Guise had given birth to Mary, Queen of Scots. Henri had invited the young queen to his court, with the intention of marrying her to his oldest son, Francois. When she arrived, Catherine had her raised alongside her own children. Much has been made about the two of them having a bitter rivalry right up until Mary returned to Scotland, but they were often reported contemporarily as getting along reasonably well. Mary and Francois were married in 1558. Later that year, Elizabeth I came to the throne of England over Mary. Catholic Europe considered Elizabeth to be illegitimate, and Mary the rightful ruler of England. What's worse was Elizabeth was a Protestant. King Henri loathed Protestants, and had many of them either burned at the stake or had their tongues cut out. Despite this, he was willing to marry his daughter Elizabeth to Edward VI at one point. He had hoped to conquer England by placing Mary and Francois on the throne and ruling through both of them. After the Italian War, one of the terms Henri had to agree to was for the now widowed Philip II of Spain to marry Princess Elizabeth in 1559. To mark the occasion, a tournament was held, which held a certain joust. Diane de Poitiers was made Queen of the Lists. The night before, Catherine had a nightmare where she saw her husband bleeding from his face. Henri rode against Gabriel Montgomery, who was captain of the King's Scottish Guard. As the opponents met, Montgomery's lance was broken and splinters of wood ended up going straight through the king's visor and into his left eye. Catherine went with her husband as his physicians rushed him away from the tournament. Although he pleaded to see Diane, Catherine refused to allow her admittance. 10 days later, Henri II of France died of his infected wound. Catherine, now widowed, would take to wearing black for the rest of her life. Immediately, Catherine sought to banish Diane de Poitiers from the French court, taking many of her properties that should rightfully have gone to her as queen. Diane meekly returned to her family seat, where she would pass away years later from heavy metal poisoning. Now the Queen Mother, Catherine allied herself with the Guise faction, who took control of the 15-year-old Francois II. Neither the Duc de Guise nor the Cardinal de Guise had any love for the Protestants, and sought to increase the late king's effort to stamp them out. Catherine went along with them just to make sure she had a place in her son's life. There was no official regent, as Francois was considered old enough to rule for himself. But the Guises were the real ones in charge. French Protestants were given a new name, Huguenots. Antoine de Bourbon was one such Huguenot, who had married Queen Jeanne of Navarre. His younger brother Louis, Prince of Condé, was made a figurehead of anti-Guise rebellion, which resulted in Condé's rebels being hanged en masse from the walls of the Château d'Amboise. Condé was captured and imprisoned in August 1560. Catherine did not feel the need for such dramatic repression, and believed that Huguenots who worshipped in private and hadn't broken the law should be left alone. If all Huguenots were to be repressed, it could easily start another uprising. I've been expecting you. So we meet again, Mr. Condé. Francois II was always considered frail since childhood. As a result, it's possible he never consummated his marriage. He had a strong personality to make up for this shortcoming, and dressed opulently to show himself off. But when it came to ruling, he seemed content to let the Guises take charge. Nevertheless, whatever further damage the Guises could make would be cut short when Francois fell ill in November of 1560. The cause was determined to be an abscess from an ear infection, but of course people suspected it was poison. On the 5th of December 1560, the brief, violent and ineffectual reign of Francois II ended. The next in line was Charles, who was 10 years old. Evidently he would need a regent until he came of age. Catherine was already prepared to take this position for herself by making a deal with Antoine de Bourbon. She would release his imprisoned brother Condé in exchange for Antoine resigning his claim to the regency. The Guise faction were paid off, and Catherine became governor of France. The young king cried during his coronation in May the following year. It seemed a portent of what was to come, as the reign of King Charles IX of France was dominated by the wars of religion. In September 1561, Catherine attempted to patch up the religious division in the realm by holding the Colloquy of Poissy. The conference was attended by dozens of Catholic authorities, including cardinals and archbishops, while the Pope, now Pope Pius IV, sent the Cardinal de Ferrara and the General Superior of the Jesuits. The Protestant side was attended by German theologians and Swiss Calvinist leaders. Neither side could come to an agreement, and shortly after, the massacre of Vassy occurred, led by the Duc de Guise, who slaughtered 100 Huguenots. This began the First War of Religion. The Protestants were being led by the now-released Condé, even though Antoine had just been made Lieutenant General of France. In response to the Protestant uprising, the monarchy revoked any and all concessions given to them in the past. Catherine managed to mediate a truce in 1563, the Edict of Amboise. 5 months afterwards, Charles declared his legal majority, but Catherine's influence on her son still controlled his decisions. The Second War of Religion began in 1567 after a failed abduction of the king by Protestants. It lasted less than a year, but by now Catherine had abandoned hope of making peace with the Huguenots and sought to oppress them instead. Later in 1568, Catherine would receive word that her eldest daughter Elizabeth had died of a miscarriage. The Third Religious War would see Prince Condé executed for treason, and Charles welcomed the new Huguenot leader to his inner circle, Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. Catherine feared the influence he had over her son. In the wake of so much religious tension, a proposal was made between France and Navarre, where Catherine's youngest surviving daughter Margot would wed Queen Jeanne's son, Henri de Bourbon. Claude was unavailable because she had been married off to the Duc de Lorraine. The marriage treaty was agreed, but not long after, Queen Jeanne came to Paris to buy clothes for the wedding and died suddenly. Catherine would be blamed for poisoning her with a pair of gloves. As you can see, the religious tensions were so thick you could have cut them with a knife when, on the 18th of August 1572, King Henri of Navarre and Margot de Valois were married in Notre Dame Cathedral. There would be much hearsay as to how the marriage went down afterwards, including King Charles forcing his sister's head down as a way of nodding in order to disprove the marriage's validity later down the line. The two 19-year-olds were civil to one another, although King Henri had to wait outside the cathedral while the mass was being held. Many Huguenots had arrived in Paris to attend the wedding, meaning they were exactly where the Catholics wanted them. 4 days after the wedding, Admiral Coligny was shot in a clear assassination attempt, but he survived. On the 24th of August, St. Bartholomew's Day, violent Catholic mobs swelled in Paris and the Duc de Guise threw Coligny from his balcony, which sparked the infamous massacre. The event is often referred to as a day, but it actually happened over 5 days. And it didn't just happen in Paris, as the violence spread to other cities, resulting in the deaths of up to 10,000 Huguenots. Margot managed to protect a handful by hiding them in her chambers, and refused to let anyone enter. She was offered to have her marriage annulled, but she declared that she had consummated her marriage. Henri was forced to convert to Catholicism to save his life. Catherine has typically been considered the architect of the massacre, beginning with ordering Coligny's assassination, and later got King Charles to agree to the following bloodbath. Artwork made after the fact shows her looking down on the slaughtered corpses outside the Louvre, from which she watched the massacre take place. Margot and Henri were kept as prisoners in the Louvre, while the Catholics and Huguenots began an endless cycle of making shaky peace treaties, which were then shattered by the smallest attack from either side. The constant stress and bloodshed done in his name possibly accounted towards King Charles's physical and mental deterioration. He began to suffer mood swings before contracting tuberculosis. He died in agony on the 30th of May 1574, leaving his younger brother, Henri d'Anjou, to take the throne. Catherine took control of things while Henri returned from his appointment in Poland to take up the crown. King Henri III would be the last Valois king. Catherine would lose 2 more of her children. Claude passed in 1575, aged 27 from childbirth complications, while Hercule, renamed to Francois during his confirmation, who had caused a lot of stress for his family in switching sides during the wars and failing to marry Queen Elizabeth I, died of malaria in 1584. King Henri of Navarre managed to escape the Louvre in 1576 and returned home, where he converted back to Protestantism. After Hercule's death, he was considered heir presumptive. Margot herself managed to escape in 1577. Henri III was considered Catherine's favourite son. Catherine remained a major part of his political process, as he had never been educated to be a king, and knew very little about running a country, let alone one that was ravaged by religious war. There had been 3 Valois kings since Henri II's death, and none of them managed to produce a legitimate male heir for the throne. Henri III himself was considered impotent. Catherine attempted to make up for her son's shortcomings by mitigating peace, but tensions were still high, and she told her son he was on the eve of a general revolt. Anyone who told him differently was a liar. Throughout the 1580s, leading to Catherine's death, Catholics, believing the Queen Mother too lenient and reviling the idea of a Protestant Bourbon taking the throne, began the Catholic League, who would intimidate Henri into giving in to their demands in 1585. His weakness was acknowledged by the Spanish Emperor, calling him an abscess about to burst. Following the execution of Mary Queen of Scots by Elizabeth I, the Spanish intended to avenge her by invading England with their armada, and the Catholic League rushed to secure the northern ports in France to support them. But we all know how well that went. Catherine had developed a lung infection. Her power was slipping further as Henri dismissed his ministers and fled Paris, as the Catholic League seized the city, controlling anyone who went in or out. Catherine would have to pass through barricaded streets just to attend Mass. 9 members of the Guise family, including the Duke and the Cardinal, were slaughtered in December of that year. The grim assassinations were ordered by King Henri, who told his mother he did what they would have done to him. Catherine was more than a little disgusted by this bloodbath. In January 1589, after a heated conversation with the Cardinal de Bourbon, who accused her of leading them all to butchery, Catherine de Medici took to her bed and died on the 5th, aged 69. Some believed it was due to displeasure of her son, but in truth it was pleurisy. Henri, now without his mother's protection, lasted less than a year as king. The backlash from killing the Guises only solidified the public's view of him as a wasteful, corrupt tyrant. Paris would be put under siege in summer of 1589, where the king was assassinated by a Dominican friar, Jacques Clement. With the Valois line now dead, King Henri IV left Navarre with an army and retook the country with the aid of England and Germany. The struggle lasted 5 years, but he ultimately triumphed. Henri then converted back to Catholicism to hold the nation, and the House of Bourbon held the French throne from then on, although you can actually count on one hand how many kings there were between the fall of the Valois dynasty and the French Revolution. Henri IV, Louis XIII, Louis XIV, Louis XV, and Louis XVI. Catherine, once the fighting had died down, would be buried at Saint-Denis Basilica in Paris, next to her husband Henri II. This was a common burial practice for kings and queens of France. In 1793, following the French Revolution and the execution of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, Saint-Denis was made a target of anti-monarchist rhetoric. The abbey was dissolved a year prior and used to store flour, before the government ordered the royal tombs to be destroyed. Many of the treasures in the abbey were looted, while many others were also destroyed, including iconography of the kings and queens of the Old Testament, which were mistaken for the French monarchy. The tombs were opened and the occupants were thrown into a mass grave. In the 19th century, Saint-Denis was reconsecrated by Napoleon Bonaparte and would continue to be restored over the following decades. Catherine and Henri were given effigies resembling their former tombs. Catherine is typically remembered as a schemer, manipulator and murderess, but a lot of this has quite likely been exaggerated by the sources that came after her death. Henri IV, who was by all rights her enemy, said, "I ask you, what could a woman do, left by the death of her husband, with 5 little children on her arms, and 2 families of France who were thinking of grasping the crown, our own and the Guises? Was she not compelled to play strange parts, to deceive the first one and then the other, in order to guard, as she did, her sons, who successively reigned through the wise conduct of that shrewd woman? I am surprised that she never did worse." R.J. Knecht states that Catherine was the perfect target of a hate campaign, fueled by xenophobia, social snobbery and misogyny. During her lifetime, she appeared to have had a favourable reputation that was written over when she died. I see Catherine de' Medici as the inspiration for many of the female villains we have come across in our lifetime, particularly the evil queen from Snow White and Maleficent. Her staunch protection of her children, regardless of how great they were as rulers, can be seen in Cersei Lannister. And yet many of these were influenced from the works written after her death, especially the novel La Reine Margot by Alexandre Dumas, whom we know better as the author of The Three Musketeers. Dumas wrote a series of novels about the fall of the Valois, though many details have been altered. Christopher Marlowe also penned his own narrative about Catherine, making her a villain. There is so much detail about her life that I can't just boil it down to a quick biography, because there is a lot of effort that goes into separating fact from fiction. It's Richard III all over again. Coming up next is the rankings, and it's interesting. We don't actually have a bad Catherine, it's just underutilised Catherines. There isn't enough lost media surrounding her to justify an extra video, but I will talk about that missing Doctor Who serial and the other adaptation of La Reine Margot, which probably doesn't have as much violence and nudity in it. I'm sorry to say that Ever After doesn't count. I'm sorry, it just doesn't. That was my first Catherine de' Medici video. Do you like the look? Finally an excuse to dress all gothic. I'll take these glasses off now because I don't have to read off the script. So initially I was hoping to do the Black Swan eye makeup. I'll do that for the rankings. I definitely will do that for the rankings. I just didn't have enough time to do it. I like the way I like the gothic look, the smoky eyes and the lipstick, which was kind of inspired by Frankenfurter. Tim Curry looks great in that lipstick. This gothic dress has a bit of a story behind it. We call it the Morticia dress in our family. It's the dress that my mother was wearing when my dad proposed. Although the corset is all mine. I just thought it would look good with the corset and push the twins up a bit. I thought doing Catherine de' Medici now would be a good opportunity because I'm finishing up Reign anyway, and already including Reign in the Catherine de' Medici rankings, so we'll just be like, we'll finish up Reign, we'll finish up Catherine de' Medici, we'll turn away from it until we have to come back to Reign for something else, like probably Robert Dudley next, depending on... Even though I couldn't put Catherine into a single video, there is another queen coming up that I can put into a single video, that being Elizabeth Woodville, because, like Elizabeth of York, doesn't have many on-screen interpretations, but can be done in a one video project. Gonna go brew some poison. I should have had the blood orange cider, that would have been perfect. So if you don't want to miss me putting on Black Swan eye makeup and dressing more gothic and showing off my twins and talking about Catherine de' Medici as they stroke the kitty, I think Alan must have known I was doing a villainous figure, so he's like, no, let me sit on your lap, it's perfect. Yes, make sure you subscribe to the channel because I would be very, very grateful if you did. Like, share, comment, all that good stuff. And also thank you to my patrons who made this possible. I'm going to go into my Cruella voice right now. They have the benefit of having their names put up at the end of every video that I do, as well as access to scripts and early access to videos, depending on which tier they choose to sign up for. And regardless of whichever tier you sign up for, when you become a patron, you will have access to my Discord, where you will get to hear me rant about whatever I have to watch for this channel. Because after I finish Elizabeth Woodville, I want to go and do another literary hot take video. And I'm pretty sure that there will be some bad adaptations that you can hear me rant to, whatever my patrons choose, because they will be voting on it. And let's not forget the King and Queen patrons, who are my highest level contributors. They are Alison Cuff, Anna from Gustine, Annalise Barnett, Jill Minero, Larissa, and Leslie Williams. Thank you all so much, darlings. Now, Mustache, much to avenge, revenge, and destroy.